Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we've got a great episode in store for you. It's the topic closest to my heart in the world of fitness, and we're going to do a big geek out and talk about what is movement mechanics. We're going to talk about how it applies to you as an athlete or even a coach, getting into the nitty-gritty with some hopefully useful examples of movement mechanics at play and how you can leverage it to get the most out of your training. But before we get into it, as always, a quick thank you to our show sponsors, The Training Stimulus. Please log on to thetrainingstimulus.com to register your interest if you would like to learn more about movement mechanics. Wit Fitness, please visit wit-fitness.com and use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hytro, please use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel.
Yeah.
Let's get into it.
Yeah, mate. I mean, movement mechanics, this is an area which has fascinated me more and more. Obviously, the longer we've done this podcast and the more we've discussed it. Hence why I signed up to your mentorship, because it's something which I could see so much value in beyond just my relatively deep level, but say surface level understanding. And then when you do really take things into that next level down and really start seeing the intricate details, and then seeing how that one, say the big toe lifting, affects then all the way up the chain because it lacks stability, mobility, and all this stuff. So it's a fascinating area of fitness, and I understand why you've kind of doubled down on it and kind of got real passion. So overall, why should people care about it? Because it's just how we move, right?
Yeah, and that's spot on. It is how we move, but how we move is kind of everything when it comes to fitness, sport, and training. I think it wouldn't be an understatement to say that applying knowledge of movement mechanics can benefit every single part of your training. It can make you stronger, it can build more power, it can improve your endurance. Obviously, mobility and range of motion are a huge part of movement mechanics as well. It can also get you out of pain. So the applications are totally across the board, and with a good understanding of how to use it, every aspect of your training will benefit. Like, even if all you care about is your aesthetics and you're a bodybuilder, don't care about your performance or function, even having a good understanding of movement mechanics will enable you to grow your muscles more effectively. So I think it is this glue that sort of sticks everything together, because the way that we move is like a huge part of what our fitness is. So that's sort of why I've pretty much dedicated my career to it. So hopefully people see some value in it.
Yeah, I think as long as when people understand it is more than just say the silly lunges and the silly arms and all this stuff, and there is science and there is intent behind what people are doing, because especially if you've ever been suggested to do any of these movements, or you've been just seeing them online and you've gone, I'm going to try that. That looks like a fun movement. And you try it, like, oh, that feels interesting. Like, I can really feel the same in my outside glutes, and I've never felt that before. And it's like, oh, actually cool. Because a lot of the time it's because we're moving in planes of motion that we don't normally move in. And that's what a lot of these movement mechanics, say, assessments that I've found, even doing from myself now, start to get an idea of, okay, when you start going beyond just sagittal, you start going beyond just up and down, you start thinking about, the side to side and also the rotation, and maybe side to side with a rotation. And just then realizing when you start combining a lot of these things and how quickly we break down, and really we shouldn't be able to be breaking down that quickly.
Yeah. So I think it's to give it sort of a bit more context, movement mechanics, when we say movement mechanics, it is as broad as how the body moves. And within that, we should be considering everything from like a scientific perspective as possible. So we're not guessing. It is real science, not bro science. So we're thinking about anatomy and physiology. We're thinking about traditional strength and conditioning training. Obviously, biology, the nervous system is a huge part of how we move. So the interplay between muscles on a cellular level and the nervous system is a massive part of it. There's even biochemistry in terms of what's going on with the chemicals that are involved in muscle contraction. And obviously with the word mechanics, physics is going to be a huge part of how we understand how the body moves because of the forces involved. And things like leverage have a huge role to play in the impact of the way we train the body and how we can manipulate these variables to essentially get the training stimulus that we want from the body. And I think once we start to piece these bits together, everything makes a lot more sense, and we can just be so much more precise with the prescriptions we have from a training basis, but also have a better understanding of when we're doing our own training, what is the intent behind an exercise selection, behind even like sets and reps. It all comes back to the way the body moves and what's the like language of information between the brain and the body and the muscles. And I think it's a hugely untapped aspect of what we can do in training, and there's a lot of benefit to be derived from spending a little bit more time and energy on it.
So at the training stimulus, what are some of your fundamentals that you focus on?
So we break everything down into movement qualities. So the key movement qualities, like you alluded to earlier, the fundamental ones would be mobility, stability, and motor control. And these three movement qualities exist at a muscle level and a joint level, and we can assess them in all three planes of motion. So it's not uncommon, and it's actually very prevalent for somebody to have great hip mobility in the sagittal plane, but poor hip mobility in the transverse plane. So this is where generalizations like saying, oh yeah, they've got really good hip mobility is too general. Like we need to get a little bit more specific into the more minutiae of movement quality details to specify exactly what sort of hip mobility we're assessing and evaluating, because it's a very different story if somebody's got great hip mobility in all three planes versus great hip mobility in just two out of three planes.
Yeah, and I guess especially when it comes to like the motor control side of stuff and understanding so it's funny because I use the word movement mechanics in general, but when you're talking about, say, in motor control, so say performing a lunge, performing an exercise of any sort, that is you understanding how to perform the reps. So you said there about obviously the hip, say, being nice and mobile in the sagittal plane. So that's obviously where we're thinking about going up and down. And then with frontal plane, we're thinking about going side to side. And with transverse plane, we're going in rotation. So if someone was, say, trying to squat, say, with a decent amount of hip mobility, but they lacked some other mobility elsewhere, how could someone maybe see that show up? Because if they think, cool, I've got a great squat, but then they break down elsewhere, what does that look like?
Yeah, good question. So in that example of somebody having good sagittal plane hip mobility, that means they've got a good range of motion through hip flexion. That's essentially closing the angle at the front of the hip, so they can bring the torso towards the thigh or thigh towards the torso with relative ease. If they lack hip mobility in the transverse plane, that generally means they're going to be missing hip internal rotation. So if you imagine your knee turning towards the midline, that's the femur twisting in the socket of the pelvis. And how that might look in a squat is as they descend through the squat, the knees get pulled excessively outwards because we would expect the knee to turn slightly in during the loading phase of a squat. So that might seem like they've got a good squat, but they're actually missing the capacity to load their glutes in the transverse plane, which is obviously a big missing piece of performance. If you can get better hip internal rotation and you have better control of it, then your ability to tap into the strength of your glutes will improve. So from a performance perspective, as well as potentially injury prevention perspective, you're leaving a little bit on the table if you don't have that transverse plane hip mobility.
So you're saying we don't want to push our knees out in a squat?
No, don't want to do that.
I know, we're not going to go there again. We've done that already.
Done a whole episode on the valgus.
Yeah. So, okay. So overall, what are some other examples maybe that people can maybe think about when they are trying to understand a little bit more about this?
Cool. So one thing that I think we need to emphasize is that these three fundamental movement qualities of mobility, stability, and motor control, they're all very linked. So I describe them as interconnected, but also interdependent. So that means they rely on each other. And this explains a lot of sort of mobility conundrums that we typically face in the gym, where things don't really make sense. So the classic one here is that you have a guy who is relatively stiff or immobile and he can't break parallel when he's squatting. But once you give him 100 kilos on his back, now he can break parallel. And that's with no stretching, no mobility work between sets. It's literally just the weight of the bar. And at the surface of that, if we just think of somebody who's got good mobility or bad mobility, that doesn't really make sense. Like, why has a more difficult squat given him better range of motion? But because mobility and stability are interrelated, we can understand that from physics, the inertia of the bar, so because it's so heavy, it takes more force to move it in space. That actually gives him stability.
Yeah.
And because he feels more stable, his nervous system will permit him a greater range of motion because he feels safer because of the added stability. So there's a few different like schools of thought going on here at the same time, but understanding the relationship between those movement qualities helps us to understand why that's working for that guy. So for him, when we add stability, his mobility improves. So the question then becomes, can we get his body to create the stability that he gets from the inertia of the heavy bar? Can we find out what area of his body is unstable and apply some targeted stability work so that he doesn't need 100 kilos to get into a decent depth of squat? So that's how we would apply it in that situation.
Yeah.
The other one, I think, go on, Nate.
I was just like, it's just that one really resonates with me because not that I have a bad squat in general, but like I've always used to use a lot of load to kind of put me into better positions. And don't get me wrong, over time it actually helped, but it probably also gave me a few other weaknesses along the way. So it was a bit of a trade-off. But it's definitely interesting because that type of thing could be, for instance, that say they're mid that thoracic back, their shoulders, that might be really tight, causing them to have a poor squat without load, because as soon as they then stabilize their whole thoracic and upper back, they actually allow their spine and everything to move as one, because it can create that solid structure. So that's a really interesting example for me. There was another one I remember you saying in a few episodes back, like a good few episodes back, one about a push-up. There was one there that was a really good one, I thought, and that was fascinating. So could you go into that one?
Yeah, so this is a really cool one. Basically, you can say somebody can't do a normal push-up, and they're close, but they can't quite do it. Quite often, they will be able to do it with their feet elevated, and most people think feet elevated push-ups are harder, and they are harder in one dimension of like load going through the hands, so there's more resistance and more work to do from the pushing muscles. But the other thing that elevating the feet does is that it lengthens the anterior core, so basically your abs are under more stretch, so they'll provide more tension, which can give more stability to the system, because the body is a system overall working together. And because there's that extra stability, that gives the body a better foundation from which to push. So somebody might be able to do feet elevated push-ups even though they can't do normal push-ups. And if you haven't seen it with your own eyes, it's hard to believe, but it is so true. I've seen it happen several times now. And the same goes for if somebody takes 1 foot off the floor. So somebody might not be able to do a push-up on 2 feet, but they can do it on 1 foot for a similar reason, in that the addition of instability or demand from the rest of the body through a principle of co-contraction fires up stabilizer muscles better, which means the athlete is actually able to exert more force than they could do under a normal push-up situation. And I think some people intuitively know this. Like, a lot of people would advance their exercise by, like, instead of doing normal push-ups, they might do one-legged push-ups. And I remember feeling this myself years and years ago. It didn't actually feel harder.
No.
And but everyone tells me this should be harder, but it doesn't feel harder because I'm actually benefiting from that co-contraction at play. And I think
Yeah.
that's quite a cool example that, again, seems counterintuitive, but once we understand the principles of these fundamental movement qualities and how they interact, it suddenly makes sense. You're like, oh, okay, that weird thing now clicks.
Yeah, I think what's a really important point there to kind of extract as well is that when you mentioned the body as a system that works together to achieve its overall goal, and I think that's something where we kind of get bogged down in, oh, okay, focus on the knees out or this or that, the focus on the hips back, and we say that it's one cue, say, to say perform something, or like, or maybe because of their hips are too tight or their knees are, they're sort of like, it's very easy to focus on, say, the pain wherever someone has this issue. Whereas when you take a step back and look at it as that whole system working together, you realize, okay, yes, the knee might be in pain, but why? And it's because actually further up or down the chain, this is causing that. And the knee is just the first point of call that it can essentially get rid of that pain. And that's where it puts it all, because that's its first point. And then when it goes further on from there, that's when you're really fucked, when it goes down. But yeah, so I think that's a really, really, really key point to kind of remember from that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that body as a system point is huge in understanding movement mechanics, because once you stop viewing things in isolation, things do make so much more sense. So in that push-up example, if somebody can't do a push-up, quite a common thought process is, oh, their pushing strength isn't good enough, so let's just go and work on their pushing strength. So you could do some dumbbell bench press, you could do some normal bench press, but what we saw in that strange example is that actually their ability to generate stability and core control was what was stopping them from being able to do the push-up. So they could develop like incredible pushing strength without improving that limiter of the core stability. And because we can see that it's the overall system that's not achieving the task, and with the movement mechanics assessments, we can try to pinpoint exactly what part of the system is that limiter. We can just go straight for that rather than working on bits in isolation. And this is sort of why doing push-up variations with, say, your hands on a box, I would say is much better than doing push-up variations on your knees, because it has so much more in common with the full push-up position, that you are getting that core challenge in similar proportions to a normal push-up. Whereas when you start taking out body parts, you're now not working the system as a whole. You are working it in isolation. And there's a time and a place for that, don't get me wrong. But
I think yeah, you're right. But I think like using, say, that as the example, even keeping with the push up there, as in like, you're going for, say, a raised push up to where you can maybe get, say, a set of 5+, so you're getting at least a good amount of volume going through that movement, and then you drop to some knees to then get some further pushing stress going through when you can't do any more full body. So then using that drop set to make it easier, so then help with obviously that overall strength. It's just funny, as we were talking about this, it kind of made me also think of how pull-ups are example with this as well, massively, because like I find bodyweight pull-ups as challenging as a weighted pull-up. Like for me, a weighted pull-up is, I'll take a weighted pull-up any day. Like I'm much more, and it's like, now whether that's just because I'm a heavier individual, and most heavier individuals will nearly always say the same, as in like doing a body weight pull up is, some people can't, and they can deadlift a lot, and they're like, I struggle to do a single pull up. And you're like, for me, that's mental. Like to not be able to do a single, like that shows there's a massive hole in that person's, say, training. But if they're fully specified into powerlifting, say, then it's not, because they don't need to do the pull-up and there's training just for that. But for me, I think that's a crazy thought, that having to use, say, for me, as I say, I like to say use weight to kind of get that co-contraction, to have that extra load to help me create better tension. So when I pull, I just pull with a much, same as kind of when I'm to say, I guess like doing, say, kipping movements as well. It's that creating that tension and the way I can kind of move through positions. Obviously that's going slightly different because I'm now taking it into a different area, but it's in like just going beyond just a standard strict pull-up. It's so much easier. So
yeah, spot on. I think that's very similar to the 100 kilo squat example in that even though on the surface it's harder, you're now doing a pull up with more weight because we understand how the movement qualities interact. Adding a bit of weight gives you a bit more co-contraction, like you said, gives you a bit more stability, so you can actually express your force better than when you're just body weight and there's more movement in the lower body. So
Yeah.
it's actually less, it's harder to create a stable base from which to pull. So then the question would be like, how can we teach your body to generate the stability that adding weight to your pull-ups provides?
Yeah.
So should we do some hanging core work? Should we, doing
Well,
like
that's always been a massive weakness for me, like
the
toaster
hanging
bar, all that
lunges?
type of stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
hanging lunges. I remember
Yeah.
seeing you doing those for the first time. I was like, "What the fuck are you doing?" Obviously, I knew there'd be something for some reason, but they were great.
You should get on it. The
Yeah,
sounds of
no.
things.
Well, mate, after the powerlifting comp, I will be doing all sorts. So, right, let's get into maybe some applications because I think obviously we've kind of taken a nice deeper dive into movement mechanics as a whole and kind of maybe why we need to have a focus on them. So, we've discussed why we should focus on them. How can we now use them? Is that obviously there's assessments and like targeting decisions on when you're training, like what exercises to choose and so forth to get the most bang for your buck. What other, obviously, I guess injury, that's an obvious
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, spot on. So I think the best known about application of movement mechanics would be through assessment. So how can we see more clearly what's going on? This could be, a full-on, full-body muscle imbalance assessment, or it could be just having a really detailed coach's eye so that you're watching a class full of people squat and you can see some things going on and infer what the root cause of those things might be, and like you say, putting in a targeted training intervention of some sort. So having a good understanding of these principles, an example came up this morning actually when I was marking one of my mentees' homework, and he did a great job of, he was assessing somebody's overhead squat, and in isolated testing for mobility, the athlete had really good ankle dorsiflexion. So they had really good range of motion and they actually had pretty good stability through that ankle as well. But when doing the overhead squat, they weren't able to access that ankle range of motion. So they were missing the motor control. So it's the specificity of that actual movement where they couldn't use the movement quality of mobility when it mattered. So that tells us that there's nothing going on at the joint that's stopping them getting to that range of motion. The body can access it, and it's actually reasonably stable. So we don't think there's a massive stability problem, but it's more of a skill limiter in that they probably haven't done enough reps. They haven't spent enough time in that position to develop the control to dynamically access that position in the movement that matters. So for that athlete, the prescription is spend more time doing it. Like there's not much point in doing extra mobility work because you have the range of motion. It's just about using it in the position that matters. And only through that assessment, looking at the joint by joint approach of testing mobility in the ankle specifically, testing the stability in the ankle specifically, and combining it with the motor control in the top end function, which for that athlete was an overhead squat. We can build that overall picture of what's really going on and where should we focus our attention. Because I think traditionally a lot of people would see that overhead squat and say, oh, they've got tight ankles, so we need to do loads of ankle mobility. But because we had done the ankle mobility assessment, we knew that wasn't actually the limiter, so we can spend our time better with more focus and actually get closer to the result sooner.
Yeah, so I guess if we kind of take a little mini step back though, and I think if you hadn't done those, or if the mentee hadn't done the assessments in the first place, say, cool, okay, right, do the classic overhead squat assessment, right, bang, okay, right, do it, bang, okay, cool, tight ankles, tight upper back, okay, sweet, right. As long as they then don't say, right, that's the now assessment done. It's like, okay, cool, that's now a observation. Now let's dig a little bit deeper, and I guess that's what today's episode is all about: is peeling back that layer of the onion and going back, say, going beyond the top crunchy layer and then going into that first soft layer and then say, right, okay, overhead squat looks like shit. Let's see why. Then let's go further. Whereas, as you say, generally it is just that, right, ankles tight, back's tight, stretch, mobilize, and see what happens. But now, because your mentee has focused on a bit more specificity and said, right, let's now look into the movement mechanics of the ankle, of the hip, the knee, all these sort of things. So we're now going through those movements and saying, oh, actually, it's just you can't overhead squat. And you need to get better at overhead squatting. So actually, you don't need to do anything like that. We just now need to get you better at understanding how to hold a load top down overhead, like going down into that position. You
Nice,
like that?
I like that. Yeah. Very good. Yeah, spot on, mate. Couldn't have said it better myself. So I think that sort of assessment is clearly like a biomechanical assessment to see what's stopping somebody get into a position from a position or mobility point of view. As the traditional view of seeing things. But I think assessment also applies to performance as well. So another nice example came up recently with bar muscle ups. Like a lot of people struggle with bar muscle ups. They're a difficult exercise, but there are quite a lot of people who you would expect them to have better bar muscle ups than they do because of their general fitness levels, their general sort of gymnastics capability. But for some reason, the bar muscle up presents an especially challenging challenge. And what was happening in this example was that as they swung into their arch position, so when they're in front of the bar and into that sort of banana shape, their spine was really extended. So there's a huge back bend as they went through, but their shoulders were actually, their arms are sort of in front of their body.
Still quite closed off.
Exactly, yeah. Quite a closed shoulder position. So that tells us a couple of things. One is that they're loose through their midline. So they're actually not getting a huge amount of tension from that core until they get to a huge end range of motion, which obviously an excessive back bend isn't, I wouldn't highly recommend it for spine health, especially under speed. And the other thing it tells us is that potentially their shoulders are tight and they're not able to get into a great degree of shoulder flexion. So something might be going on with their lats as well. So because we can see those two things and have an understanding of the movement qualities, we know that by getting a little bit more tension through the abs so they kick in and provide some power sooner without such excessive stretch, that will help power generation in the bar muscle ups. And also in the shoulders, we need to do a little bit of digging to understand why are they not able to load the shoulder as well. Is it a mobility issue? Is it a stability issue? Are they not able to access their lats effectively? And if we address those two things, the performance of the bar muscle up will increase because they're not flailing around so much. There's not so much wasted energy and motion, and the force is going where we want to in terms of generating a kip swing to create upward lift and get them over the bar.
Yeah, and I guess now if we move into a bit of training as well, I guess this is now where understanding movement mechanics gives us a deeper understanding of what accessories or what main lift should be programmed. Because, for instance, using, say, a squat as an example, for instance, having maybe a staggered barbell back squat might be your main lift for a good while. And that's the thing. I think something that once I kind of got my head around movement mechanics, like the exercises which are often prescribed from, say, an assessment not being like proper exercises, once I kind of got my head past that, and then more than rehab and prehab and all this stuff, it's actual training, which we brought up many times, is and understanding that actually doing a staggered squat might be really beneficial to my weakness, which then in the long run, because it's keeping me extremely close to the back squat, doing a stagger squat, because I'm still doing the same movement pattern. And that's the thing, I think, as we keep alluding to in this episode and other ones, where we want to stay as close to the movement itself. And the further and further we go away, the harder it is to kind of going to relate it back to that main movement. So let's maybe stick with the squat. What would be something that maybe you kind of think of here?
Yeah, it's a really nice example there that when you've identified something to work on, say we're looking at somebody's squat and we see a bit of a shift in their squat. They're not injured. There's no pain, and there's no like major red flags. For us to tell that person they need to go and do hundreds of lunges to try and address this imbalance it's not only unappealing to that athlete because they don't really see why they need to do it, but it's also not the most effective use of their training effort and time, because presumably they're squatting to get a better squat. So we actually want to keep them squatting, but how can we improve their squat and get ahead of any imbalance that might be building in the background? And exactly like you said there, we could just do something like a simple tweak to their setup to stop them shifting so much to one side, to start to put more emphasis on the weaker side that maybe isn't doing as much, to teach it that it can load as well as the strong side. And just in that subtle tweak, we are still building their squat strength. We're not taking them out of training, because that's why I've called the company the training stimulus, because it is still all about training. We want them to be getting stronger in the way that matters to them. But because we've seen it and because we know how to address it, we can kill two birds with one stone, in that we are improving their movement mechanics, they are improving their squat, and they feel like they're still training. Even though it's a subtle thing, it can still be, like you say, your main movement. Like it's still a back squat in their eyes, they're still lifting heavy, but with that subtle tweak, they get more benefit than either doing pure movement mechanics or just squatting like they're used to and continuing to bed in a compensation pattern that might cause a problem later down the road.
Yeah, because I think as a key thing there you say is that buy-in as well. Like if you can see, as say a coach, and you see someone and as they're not in any pain or anything, and you think, I could really help this person, how can I do it? That's a really nice way. And I guess also, like, if you know that say someone's got a bit of a weaker side compared to the other side, telling people that they can do more volume, they can do more reps on another leg, like on their weak leg. You can do 20 reps compared to 10 reps. You know, you got to build up strength on the other leg. It's always that. It's a funny one, because people think, but I'm going to make it unbalanced. It's like, you already are unbalanced. So it's like, I get it. I really do. Like, imagine doing step ups, and I've like got two dumbbells in my hands, and I'm going to be going through, and I'm like, I've gone to a set of 10, say, and I've got to continue all on one leg. It just feels weird. So it's like I've done it with my arms before. It's like I've started a set with just doing left arm bicep curls, and then I've gone in for my full set with both arms, because I was like, that side needs more work. So I just cool, I need to just do a little bit extra. And rather than leaving it to the end, I do it at the start where I have more energy, because that's where it needs more focus. Yeah. So rather than
just a quick one on that. There's a nice way of building asymmetrical reps into programs, and that's basically by doing like alternating reps. But instead of just straight alternating, you could do sets of 3, 5, or 7, starting and finishing with the same side. So you can go left, right, left, or left, right, left, and then do it again. So if you're doing, say, 10 reps, you could do 2 sets of 5, which will be 6 to the left, 4 to the right. And it's just a nice way to feel like you're emphasizing that weaker side without just doing them all at once. And like you say, it feels so strange to like start or finish with just doing one side of the body.
Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna include that in my training now. So I like it. So any more ideas on, say, traditional drills or anything like that?
Yeah, so I think it helps us, movement mechanics can help us understand why traditional drills are used and whether they're appropriate for us or our clients. And I think once you start to break things down into the movement qualities that they seek to train, we know what the training stimulus that's intended is, and whether that aligns with our goals and what the adaptations we're trying to drive in our body. So the example I think of for this is like ankling. It's a weird niche running drill, which I'm probably I didn't realize how niche it was until today. But basically it's sort of like tiptoeing, like running, but only on your tiptoes and barely bending your knees. So you're sort of just toeing your way down the track. And it's a very traditional running drill. And it's essentially training stiffness in your feet, or we might call it supination, your ability to toe off and reduce your ground contact time. So for people who are a little bit flat-footed or quite slow off the ground, it's a really great drill to train that particular aspect of movement and run mechanics. But if somebody's already quick off the ground and already has stiff ankles, it might not be the best use of training time, but only because we can evaluate things through that lens of what movement qualities are trying to train. And we've done a bit of an assessment to understand what how our body works, can we like unpick that? And it is very simple, but I think the more deliberate we can be with those sorts of training decisions and picking accessory drills, the better bang for buck we get from all of our training. We don't put in junk movements just because
Yeah.
someone else is doing them. We put in the ones that are going to benefit our body most.
That's the thing, because most people are pushed on time, and even if you're not pushed on time, you're still going to be wasting time on things that aren't really going to give you that extra step. And I think, like, there's like that really blanket term, "Oh, your core's weak." So, like,
Yeah.
this, if we stick with the bar muscle up one as earlier on, right, that you use. So, if you want to say, right, your core's weak, right, okay, let's go and do some crunches and some planks. It's like, okay, cool. Are those two movements valid exercises? Yes, they are valid exercises. Could there be a bit more specific exercises? Probably a hollow, which is essentially one of the positions, and maybe some leg raises from the hanging position, because they're the positions that you're going to get into in a bar muscle up. So there's still like movements where you're getting some flexion and extension, and you're also getting an isometric hold. So you're hitting all three parts, but they're more specific to the task at hand, rather than leaving it as that blanket term of weak abs or weak core.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, I didn't realize how much that triggered me until you said it. Like you got a weak core, but yeah, it's so true that like, what are you training your core for? Like, where's your weak core showing up? Like, we need to be better than just generic weak core. It's like, what do you want to use your core for, and how can we make it stronger for that? So if you're looking for a bar muscle up, like exactly like you said, how can we train the core to be better for a bar muscle up? So hanging would be great because has obviously the similar position to the bar muscle up, and then the core needs to take us from flexion to extension. So yeah, hollows
Yeah.
and arches and leg raises are great ways to do that.
Yeah, and I think also there may be, from a coach's perspective, if you're talking to a client, you can say, okay, cool, your say core was pretty weak in that, and then break it down a little bit more. You don't need to go into the nuance and like the real nitty gritty, but you can say, right, your core was weak in that bar muscle up. For instance, you couldn't get your legs up, so you lacked some, that being able to get your toes towards the ceiling as you're coming up in the bar muscle up. So giving them a little bit extra information, or then if you're say a client trying to tell a coach in a class, oh, I'm really struggling by muscle ups at the moment, I really feel I've got a weak core at the moment, and say, and then it's then for the coach say, what part of it does it feel weak? It's because I just can't get my legs up in it. It's like, cool, then it just opens up that discussion. But it is, as I think we've alluded to so many times here, it's like taking that extra layer down. So I guess where this, I think for me, what movement mechanics kind of stems from was more from injury. That was more where I kind of initially, when I like way back when, it's like most people always leave it till it's too late. When something's hurting, it's like, right, what's wrong? They've probably seen a physio or a chiro or something like that, and it's just always a temporary thing, and it keeps coming back. So it's like, right, okay, let me see what's the actual issue, and let's break it down into knowing exactly what's wrong, so that we can start moving forward and not keep coming back to the same position. So maybe let's dive into a little bit deeper about dealing with injury.
Yeah, spot on. I think you're right in that people don't really give a shit about it until they're in pain, and then they've got a strong incentive to give a shit about it. And that was the same for me. So I don't expect it to be different for anybody else. But it's only once you start digging into it, you realize how useful it is, even for the uninjured population. But I think as an example of how we can use knowledge of movement mechanics to understand and deal with injury, something that comes up quite often in CrossFit and in squatting, patellar tendonitis. It's essentially an overuse of the knee. And there can be obviously multiple causes for it, but depending on the cause will also change how we go about the treatment. So it's not as simple as, oh, we've diagnosed patellar tendonitis, I'm going to print you off the patellar tendonitis program, because we need to understand what exactly has caused patellar tendonitis. And if we go like super simple on this, if you've got dysfunction in your calf in either direction, so your calf could be too stiff or your calf could be too loose, you can end up with patellar tendonitis. But only by treating the one that it is are you actually going to help resolve it. So if somebody's got a really stiff ankle and their calf's super tight, they could be putting too much into that knee because it can't shift forwards in their squat. So for them, foot mobility, calf mobility will help relieve that patellar tendonitis because we're able to get into a better position and spread the workload throughout that leg a little bit better. But on the other side of the spectrum, if somebody's super flexible and has no tension through their calf and they've got excessive range of motion, then doing more stretching on that calf and foot is actually going to exacerbate the issue because they're already flying forwards with that knee. It's smashing into end range, and that's what's causing the tendonitis. So the medicine for one is the poison for the other. And for that person, we actually need to go about tightening up that calf, creating more tension and stability so that it can decelerate the knee shifting forwards in the squat sooner so that it doesn't smash into the patellar tendon. And I think only through seeing the difference in movement qualities and doing that tiny bit of assessment to see which camp the calf falls into, can we apply the correct intervention to address the patellar tendonitis. And I think this is a bit of a bugbear I have around sort of generic injury fix programs that don't have any assessment in, because it's to treat both those people would involve quite different approaches. And we need to just have that one, like you say, I'm getting hungry for onions now, some onion rings, but that one layer deeper understanding of what's really going on is what transforms an unsuccessful intervention into a successful one.
Yeah, and I guess, and say if, as I mentioned earlier, in a way, like if you're a trainee and you have a coach or you have someone that you can talk to about this, ask them for that one layer deeper. And like I say, because I think most people, like including yourself, if you're doing something, you can say, right, there's a lot of pain here, and it's like, so you could diagnose yourself with this, say, patellar tendonitis, but then say, okay, to the coach, cool, can you help me understand a bit more what's going on? And if they don't understand, then it gives them an opportunity to learn more. Again, a lot of the things that I've learned through injury is through self diagnosing and fixing, because I've through my training career, I've busted myself up a lot of times, and I've had to kind of find fixes, and sometimes it isn't as straightforward as, okay, that just needs a bit of time. Sometimes it's actually I've been creating such a poor movement pattern that it's just getting worse and worse and worse, and it's just like the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? It's that last little bit of movement, and it's not actually, say, the shoulder, it could be the elbow, do you know what I mean? It's just something else, and it's just one of those things where I think it really does pay dividends to try and get an assessment done. Like, no plug in for that, but it really is like having an assessment that if you are feeling that you're either like lacking progression or lacking performance across the board, it can really benefit you. And I think, because even you mentioned there, like we touched on it earlier, where you said like that person that may having a slight shift in their hip, but there's no performance loss at the moment. They feel great. There's no injury or anything like that. So it's like, if you're the coach, you can say, actually, right, let's get that in. Let's get something that's going to help them improve that isn't too far dissimilar. And then, because the injury part will probably come at some point, they might get away for their whole career. But just imagine if you was able to address something that they didn't even know they had, say, necessarily wrong with them, and what their potential then could become. Because if they're doing that subpar, just imagine what they could be doing when they're at full potential. So
yeah, that's a really good point. I really like what you said about the explaining why as well. I think if your coach tells you to do something and tells you why, your buy-in is going to be so much greater, and also the intent with which you do the exercise. I think a common issue I faced in the past with prescribing movement mechanics exercises is that people would go away and do them sort of absent-mindedly without being clear on what the intended training stimulus is. And if we go back to that patellar tendonitis example, doing a calf exercise for range of motion or for tension and stability can look very similar, but in terms of the execution, that can be where one exercise has two different effects, two different training stimuli. So for the athlete, it's important to know what the exercise is trying to achieve so that they can execute it with the right intent. Because if they're doing it thinking this is just a balance exercise, when actually it should be a balance exercise working to your end range of motion,
Yeah.
you might not be getting the benefit of that exercise. So I think it's always worth taking that extra few seconds to explain we're doing this because this links to that, which is going to get you what you want in training. And just make sure you put your focus on this part of the exercise, because that's where you're going to get the benefit, versus just absent-mindedly going through the motions.
Yeah, the absent-mindedness is the killer. Like, you see people just like flopping their arms up overhead, and there's just nothing behind it, and you're just like, you are just moving. There's just no intent, and that goes through people's warm-ups when they forget the movement mechanics, like getting inside bench press and they're doing their warm-ups. And as I've mentioned on previous podcasts, like, if there's no intent in your warm-ups, how do you expect the intent to suddenly switch on when you get to your top set? Like, the whole purpose of the warm-ups is priming that body, not only just for the load, but to tell your body how to do the exercise and how to execute it with that intent and that power. So I guess there's a couple of takeaways. I guess one of the key ones would be, make sure you consider how well you move in all three planes. Mr. Triplanar himself, make sure understanding sagittal, frontal, transverse, thinking about going in rotation. A lot of us don't move outside of sagittal. We do not move side to side, and we don't rotate much until we have to, and then that's normally where we tweak something. So make sure we're considering how much triplanar movement are we doing in our training, and where can we integrate it in so we can steadily build it up, so we're not just then suddenly doing these crazy rotational movements and your body's just like, I can't deal with this, because it has to be a steady build, just like normal progressive overload.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think the way I think about that is that, like we said at the start about the hip mobility, if you're looking for good range of motion through your hips, considering all three planes could be the key to unlocking the main planes. If you are trying to work on hip mobility in the squat, it could be your hips ability to go sideways or rotate that's actually holding you back. But you think because your sagittal range of motion is good, the hips are sweet. But I think if we just look a little bit broader and think, do my hips actually move well in all directions, or is it just like the main one that I'm looking at?
Yeah, and I guess obviously looking at the body as an overall system, like that, for me, I think, especially even from doing the mentorship myself now, and we're only how many weeks in? Is six? Yeah, but about 6 weeks in. So yeah, so we moved up to the shoulders now. We've done the shoulders, and we've got to go back through it all again. And it's been fascinating to kind of really get a deeper understanding of how. I always used to joke about it in a way like how, oh, your right shoulder hurts, it's probably your left ankle. And you joke about it even but it could be. And that's the thing, because it does stem from the floor, right? It's ground up in that way. And it's like, if something's going wrong there, it's going to find somewhere, and it might shift through the hip and end up in the shoulder. So it's understanding that the body as an overall system, I think, has been massive.
Definitely. Yeah. So I love the analogy of your body being a team, and all the players in the team need to pull their weight for it to work well. So if something's not going right, have a think about which player in the team might not be pulling its weight, because it's not always the one that's complaining. So if it is that shoulder that's hurting, maybe he's just doing someone else's job, and the hip or the ankle is actually the lazy player that needs a little bit of a slap.
Yeah, and I think lastly, I guess considering one layer deeper, that nice onion analogy, and like we need to be eating more onions, people. So we need to be getting deeper and understanding that a bit more, and thinking about more that, is it your mobility, is it the stability, or maybe it's you just can't do the movement as we discussed earlier with that overhead squat. Like, it could just be that you just need better understanding of how to move. So
spot on. Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is, for me, if you are a trainer, even if you're not, if you're just interested in movement, the fundamental language to describe movement is joint motions and joint positions. So can you describe what the three planes of motion are at an ankle, at a knee, at a hip, in the spine, in the shoulders? And once you're able to articulate what you're seeing, everything starts to make a lot more sense. You can describe a hip shift in a squat with some precision. And because you can describe it with some precision, you can then decide on the best accessory exercise with a little bit more intent as well. So if you are a trainer, my top tip is to go back to whether it's level 3 PT or whatever course you did, to revise those joint motions and think, all right, I know that hip is adducting rather than abducting.
Nice. And I mean, you could always just sign up to your training stimulus mentorship. That would probably be the better option, right?
Of course.
There we go. So that is option number one. And as this is a genuine thing, I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I am behind on my homework, classic schools, but I'm thoroughly enjoying learning more and digging deeper into these things. And if you are a trainer looking to understand more than just, okay, your hip shifting to the right, and you want to know why and maybe how to prescribe the particular exercises that are going to benefit that person, whether it's your training or your clients, I really do personally recommend it. And this isn't asked for. So, yeah.
Thank you, mate. Appreciate that.
All good. So, I hope you enjoyed it. This wasn't a sales pitch, we promise. I just tried to end it like one it seemed like, but I did. I think, if you are interested in learning more, definitely check that out. If not, there's so much information online. As Ash said there, go back to some basics level 3 stuff, understand more about the planes of motion and think about what the body does in different planes and maybe what your training is lacking. Because I think it's really clear, look at your training plan, say, what ones am I not doing and what could I do a little bit more of? And don't forget to progressively overload. And if you're not a trainer and you're just feeling a bit ropey or you just want to improve, talk to us and we'll help you out. So as always, really do hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you very much for your time as always, and we look forward to speaking to you next week.
Cheers, guys.